The invasion of Kursk has been a military disaster for Russia, but is it also an economic disaster as well? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to get behind the curtain in the Russian economic disaster that the Kursk invasion has caused. Okay, so the number one story to think about here is China. Why? Because Russia and China, or rather Russia has latched itself to China for most of its economic needs, right? Russia, due to the profound US and European sanctions the country's been subject to, has found itself reaching far and wide for allies. And they've got such illustrious friends as Iran, North Korea, and most notably, China. Well, China is the second largest economy in the world. So for Russia, being able to sell Russian goods from them and purchase manufactured goods from China are two key pieces of ensuring the Russian war effort is able to continue. But the problem is, China's learning it can't play both sides of this war. And nearly all Chinese banks are now refusing to process payments from Russia, according to one report, right? Apparently, 98% of Chinese banks, even small regional ones, are now refusing to accept direct payment transfers from Russia. This is coming from a Russian import company. This is ramped up over the last 3 weeks, right, in conjunction with the Ukraine invasion of Kursk. Now, why? That's the big question. The answer is simple. That Russia and its trade partners have been sanctioned heavily by the United States and the West more generally. And so Russia is trying to find banks who are so small that they are off the radar of the larger financial system. But it's really hard, right? Globalization cuts both ways, and even these smaller banks are increasingly finding themselves subject to sanctions, right? They're trying, of course, Russia's trying to use non-US dollar currencies to circumvent it. They've been closed out of SWIFT, right? But Russia is an expert at looking at workarounds for sanctions, right? But in December, the U.S. approved something called secondary sanctions, targeting the financial institutions that were enabling Russia to circumvent these sanctions, like these small Chinese regional banks. Here's where things get sort of shitty for Russia, is that more and more the U.S. economy is cracking down on these Chinese banks, right? For a long time, the U.S. economy, it was seen as faltering, right? And you had a sort of rising unemployment rate. And the thinking was actually that the U.S. economy, right, especially given the level of inflation, that the U.S. economy couldn't afford to punish China, right? China makes cheap goods. And if you remove the U.S.'s key manufacturer of cheap stuff from the economy, it's going to drive prices even higher, which is not what the U.S. wants in an election season. And so the U.S. kind of had to sit there and go, well, as long as China's selling us cheap stuff, we kind of have to let them do whatever they want. China, in turn, was having a failing economy, like way worse than the United States. Deflation was, in fact, their biggest threat. And so they were making deals with everybody, including Russia. But here's what happened, appears to have happened, rather, is that Russia, or rather China, in its dealings with the United States, the U.S. economy actually is on the come up, right? Now we're talking about a federal rate cut, meaning inflation has been tamed pretty thoroughly. And so now the U.S. can say, listen, now that inflation is nice and low, we're not that worried about having to take the stick of consequences and beat Chinese firms over it. We don't need your cheap stuff, not nearly as badly as we used to. In fact, China, you need us more than we need you. And so the United States has likely said, listen, those banks that we were kind of looking the other way, those little regional banks, stop it. None of them should be processing Russian transactions. And China is looking and saying, listen, our economy is, we can't choose both partners. And between Russia and the United States, the answer is clear. China needs the United States way more than it needs Putin's Russia. And you see it. Literally, Chinese banks are slowly raising the rate they charge Russians to exchange their rubles for yuan by almost 10%. So now, every time, because remember, you can't buy Chinese goods with rubles. You've got to buy them with yuan. And when you're a big bank, when you're a big buyer, it takes a lot of yuan. The problem is, Russia said, not only are we doing the market exchange rate, we're doing the market exchange rate plus 10% to reflect the fact that once we make a deal with Russia, the United States are going to punish us. And they need to price in that risk. That means that Russia, what does it need to do? Needs to print more rubles to get their to make sure they have enough rubles to conduct these more expensive exchange rates. Again, imagine 10% more rubles on top of the already substantial Russian inflation. It's going to take what's currently an 18% inflation rate, or an 8% inflation rate, and it's going to make it 18%. That's the difference between inflation, problematically high inflation, and an inflationary crisis. And so it appears that China is finally saying enough is enough. We're not going to piss off the United States just in order to sell, 8% of our exports to Russia. Now, if you're interested in seeing the combat side of the fighting in Kursk and you want to support this channel, keep it independent, able to do this kind of analysis every single day for you guys, from the battlefield all the way to the central banks, well, you can support me on combatvetnews.com. In fact, just today, we got some crazy footage of a unit operating in Kursk. The footage was 72 hours old. So if you want to get access to that cool 72-hour-old Kursk footage, by the way, when people talk about the fact that Russian resistance was light, and it's light, guys. And also, Russian forces appear to be leaving in a real hurry. So, but if you want to check out that footage, plus you want the weekly Q&A that just dropped, we talked about Afghanistan, we talked about the future of Ukraine and the cleanup efforts that it's going to take. That video also dropped today for lieutenant tier and colonel tier folks. So if you're interested, go to combatvetnews.com or click the link in the description to support this channel, support the analysis. Okay. How else do I know that China is likely pivoting to become more friendly with the United States and a little less friendly with dirtbags like Putin? Well, because the other major thing that China's been doing to really, really damage the United States has been shipping fentanyl all over the place. And if you've watched literally any video on YouTube about any major city, you can't get away from the frantic, phenomenal amount of drug use. And China finally has said, okay, we'll cut down on these guys who are manufacturing fentanyl precursors, right? China already said, so this has been its own thing. Fentanyl deaths are rising, killing something like 80,000 Americans this year, I believe is the number, or in the last 12 months. Really, again, fentanyl is like what? A 9/11 that's every 2 weeks. Right? It's a large number of deaths of Americans. And China, first, is the one manufacturing fentanyl. And it's manufacturing it and it's shipping it not to the United States, but to Mexican cartels who then repackage it, cut their drugs with it, and ship it here into the United States, where it kills a lot of Americans. And the United States has been trying to get China to cut this out, to stop doing it. We got them, the Chinese, to say, fine, we won't manufacture fentanyl. So what they did instead was manufactured, basically, not fentanyl A, fentanyl component A, and fentanyl component B. And all you got to do, and they shipped them to the cartels. And all the cartels had to do is mix and match. Stir them together, boom, you got fentanyl, right? Precursor chemicals. Finally, China said, we'll stop that too. Just 10 days ago. Weird, right? That the timing is pretty good. Got to admit. Ukrainians push into Kursk within days of the fact that China explicitly is like, listen, we're playing ball with the United States now. We're not going to process payments from Russian firms. We are going to raise the exchange rate on the ruble. We're not going to be accepting cheapo Russian rubles. You want us to take your rubles, you got to pay big time for it. All of this is putting the squeeze on Putin, But that's not enough. The Ukrainians, we know they're in on it too, obviously. Because one, China is getting rewarded for playing ball with the United States. As you can see, the harder it's cracked down on Putin, the better its economy has looked. China's consumer prices, it seems like China might be pushing through its deflationary crisis. There's light at the end of the tunnel. But the Ukrainians, did they know? Were they like, hey, it's time we're squeezing Putin on the economic side, on the China side, on the West. Let's squeeze him from the East too. The Ukrainians, the town of SUDA, this is one of the first towns, the first really substantive areas that they're calling it a city. It's a large town, I guess. It's one of the first ones that they seized as they rolled over the border. But it has two key things in it. The first, though, is the railway hubs, right? Here's all the rail lines that were fed by SUDA. And you can see that basically, if you want to get military equipment anywhere in the Kursk region, the SUDA rail line and some accompanying rail lines are actually in a lot of trouble. Because remember, you can disrupt a rail line, sure, by physically capturing the hubs, as they've done in SUDA, but you can also, if you're in SUDA, you could bring up artillery and drones and just demolish the rail lines elsewhere. And so this is going to impede, and not destroy, but impede both military traffic, military gear moving into Kharkiv, for example, but it's also going to impede the economic activity, the ability to ship civilian goods and services up and down this rail line. And crucially, Russia needs these rails to move the things the little bit they do sell in Europe. But wait, there's more. SUDA was also home to a European gas metering plant. And in 5 months, so right now, European gas is flowing through the pipeline because both Russia and Ukraine make money from that sale. And Europe does still want this gas pipe Europe needs this natural gas. And so everybody agreed, believe it or not, throughout this war, gas has still flowed through the pipeline, through SUDA. And Europe has said, listen, we need this. Inflation's high. We cannot afford to have gas prices get even higher. And so they asked the Ukrainians, listen, just leave this pipeline alone. Let the Russian gas flow, even though you're literally bankrolling your enemy. But again, in the West, inflation's cooling down a little bit. And in Russia, inflation's ramping up. And so for the Ukrainians, they've said, listen, we've got a deal. We had a deal to keep selling this Russian gas, letting it flow through SUDA until the end of 2024. After that, we're cutting off the pipelines. And now that they actually control the pipeline, that threat feels real credible. So that is where Putin is right now, losing a lot of sleep. His rail lines destroyed. His gas metering pipeline crushed, or at least in grave danger. His primary trading partner, China, walking away from their deals, and China looking stronger and better than ever. Not better than ever, but at least less likely to be in crisis. So, if you are Putin, not only have you had a military disaster in Kursk, which is still ongoing, but you're facing an economic disaster as well. Guys, be sure to subscribe to the channel. That makes a huge difference for me, as well as a huge thank you to the Colonel tier members like Martin Baum, Greg Pace, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, James Ola, Chris Holmes, and Chris Gorsuch, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys make this whole thing possible, and I appreciate you so much. I'll see you all in the next one.